Welcome. You have found the show we call Real Men Don't Cry, or do they? This is a podcast for men, and on this show, we will hear real-life stories from men about how they have navigated the complexities of being a man in this modern day. We are going to look at the boys don't cry way of thinking and how that has influenced them and how they have risen above societal pressures to be true to themselves. The focus of this show is men's real-world experiences, not just ideas and theories. I hope that you will learn from what they have discovered and use it in your life as well. Let's get into today's show. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Real Men Don't Cry, or Do They? I'm Brennan Archer, and I have my most international guest to date. I'll let him fill you in on where he is in the world, but I'd like to welcome Nick Sabine to the show today. Thanks for being here, man.
Thanks, Brandon. An absolute pleasure.
Yeah. You know, we were talking a little bit before this, and the fact that we don't know a lot about each other is fantastic because I've been really happy with the way the podcasts have been going, because they're supposed to be exploratory. They're supposed to be like, hey, what's Nick's story? What's he about? What happened in his life that makes him who he is today? So I'm kind of I probably know the least about you than any guest I've had on yet. So that excites me. Like we were talking about, you're excited too, because who knows what's going to happen today. So why don't you just give us a 30-second, 60-second snapshot of who you are, what you do, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I feel the same way. The unknowingness of where this conversation will take us is it's exciting. So I'm originally from Sydney, and in 2004, I left to go to Europe to go to my brother's wedding. And I said that I'd be gone for 4 weeks, and I haven't gone back yet. And I don't think I will, much to my mum's disappointment. So that kind of shift, that was a significant shift for me in terms of growing up in Sydney, which has a certain kind of culture, and I always had an aspiration to experience the world, and so that opportunity to leave really felt like I felt a calling to do that, and I feel in a strange way more European than I do Australian now. And my journey has taken me through building a company based in the electronic music space, and now I work as a transformational coach and men's work facilitator.
Amazing. So 20 years ago, you jumped continents and never looked back. How old were you when that move?
I would have been 23.
So how do you think that changed the trajectory of your life?
Hugely. I left with, as I said, this aspiration to see more of the world. And I started a project when I was 19 called Resident Advisor, which was a electronic music platform that I started with a co-founder to really talk about music that we loved and to help people in Sydney find the best parties, basically. And that was a huge passion point for me. And I grew up as an only child. I had a brother in England, but I grew up as an only child, and I really longed for a sense of belonging growing up. And I really found that in the dance music community in Sydney. And so I really decided that I wanted to contribute to it in a meaningful way. And then my way of doing that was actually create this platform to talk about music that moved me emotionally and that I was inspired by. And what I didn't realize at the time, or what we didn't realize at the time, was by creating something that was community driven and hyper local for Sydney, we were actually creating something that could be hyper local for all these different cities around the world. And it's now grown into still in an independent operation, but it's grown into a huge brand within the electronic music space that's built on the same premise that it was originally built for. And that project has informed much of my life. and much of my friendships. And we can talk a little bit about how that impacted my identity soon, I'm sure. But that project never could have reached its potential or even grown in the way that it had I not moved to Europe. And that project had a fundamental impact on my life. So the kind of sliding doors moment of after those 4 weeks going back or staying in Europe, like it just feels like those paths are so divergent in terms of where I might be now.
So take me back, if you can remember, to it's coming up on 4 weeks. You're supposed to go back to Australia, and you're like, what's the process going on that you realize, no, I'm going to stay here?
I actually think I desired to get away from Sydney. I don't think I was as conscious of it as I am now in reflection, but I think I really craved to get away as soon as possible. I remember actually when I finished school at 18, the first thing I did was jump on a plane and go to England for 9 months. You know, the moment I could go, I did go. And then here was another opportunity to go. And I went again and then never came back. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about my kind of story of origin and relationship to my parents and the home environment and so on. But it was fairly fractured. And I think it really impacted me in a way where I didn't desire to kind of maintain that environment and actually move beyond that and start to forge my own life.
Yeah, that's what was going through my head. I'm like, I wonder if that has something to do with severing a connection with your family, because I was 17 and I left and I basically never looked back. So I heard something in your story. I'm like, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, it only dawned on me a few years ago when I realized I had this idea of like, like literally the first moment I could go, I went. And
Yeah.
and then I needed to go back, or I thought I needed to go back for studies. But then again, the moment I had an opportunity to go, I went, and I just felt this sense of liberation by being on the other side of the world. And also London was a epicenter for electronic music, which was my huge passion point. So here I'd landed in this place where I could live with my brother, and it was, one of the homes of electronic music. And that was a culture that I was building something within, but also had this huge affinity towards. And so it was a real playground for me and a real opportunity to forge my own story.
Very cool. I shared with you before we hit record that I had an opportunity to work in Europe when I was early 20s as well, and I never took it. And you asked if I regretted it, and I don't know the answer to that. I've got to think more on that, and I'm going to get back to you at another time. But I have a question on the relationship with your brother. How well did you know him before you moved to Europe?
So I would see him, he was 8 years older than me, and he actually introduced me to electronic music because he was a touring DJ. So he would come to Australia over summer and play a bunch of shows. And I was a 14-year-old kid when he would start taking me to nightclubs. And if you imagine what a sensory overload they are, even for adults at 14, just, being stood in the booth with my brother and watching him perform, it was just so mesmerizing. I just remember thinking I want to be part of this. This is incredible. And so that kind of planted the seed of, my sense of desire to really explore this music and explore this culture and eventually contribute to it. But because I would only see him once a year, we had these really intense moments of connection, and then nothing for 11 months. And because my father was an alcoholic, and he lived in the house, but he was kind of physically there, but emotionally absent. And so my brother, who was 8 years older, actually kind of played like a fatherly role to some degree, but only 1 month a year. So I remember as a child, I remember my brother coming, and I would be excited for months beforehand. It was such a like I would literally like have like the date marked in the calendar and would count the days down because I grew up as an only child, and my brother would come once a month, and I had a brother for 1 month a year while I grew up, and that was all I wanted. And we had similar interests, and we would play cricket together, and like all of these things that I love doing. And then I remember the times when he would leave that I would be devastated. It's actually just, I haven't really thought too much about it, but I would say that those moments of his departure was some of the most significant, like emotional release moments of my childhood. Because I remember just the days that he would leave, I would just be in absolute tears. And yeah, I can't think of many more moments where I was like that emotionally expressive growing up. So I would say it was beautiful, but it was short and intense and odd in its kind of infrequency.
So you said you were 23 when you made the move to Europe. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he would have been early 30s. What role did he start playing in your life when you got to see him more often?
I mean, he was my older brother, so he would just play that role of like I wanted to be like him, and I just looked up to him hugely. And then when I got to England, he kind of continued that role, but ultimately we became closer and closer once I was living in England. And I would say that the gap between us just got smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point of it just became a very deep friendship. And there were years, less so now, but there were years that we would go and we would speak to each other literally every day, just as a check-in call, or he'd be walking somewhere or what have you, and he'd give me a call, and so on. So I feel like the role, like we became kind of more, it moved from this kind of like older brother / father dynamic to a friendship dynamic ultimately.
Yeah, because 8-year spread. I'm trying to imagine, man, if I had an 8-year-old, a sibling that was 8 years older than me, what that would mean. That's huge, man. Because they're not your parent, but our parents when we're children are gods. We don't know any different. We're looking to them for guidance all the time. How do I do life? Who am I? But then you factor in, you've got an older sibling. That must have been quite a wild experience to have, like, here's mom, here's dad. You shared a little bit about your dad, maybe just emotionally absent. But then you've got another like godlike / parent figure in your life. I have you thought a lot about that and what that meant to you?
I haven't thought a huge amount about it. I guess one of the odd things was also he would sometimes have to play a fatherly role from distance. So sometimes, like, I was a tricky teenager, let's say, and sometimes my mum would be so exacerbated with my behavior that she would have to call my brother in England and say, like, you need to have a word with your younger brother. And then sometimes, and he would use some pretty forceful language to suggest that, like, I needed to pull my head in and get into line. And in kind of playing that kind of fatherly role to some degree. So yeah, he was multiple things to me growing up. He was my older brother, he was my father. I was just looking up to him with so much admiration. He was also like, forging a career in the culture and the community that I was like falling in love with. And so there was so much to look up to, and I'm really grateful for what he introduced me to. My love for music was really shaped by those early years of him introducing me to stuff that he was excited about. But yeah, well, it was a strange kind of three-way dynamic for sure.
Well, it sounds like a gift.
I think it's a gift, but remember that was only 1 month a year, so that the absence was hugely felt outside of those. So I kind of had a window into what it could be like to have a brother, and then for 11 months of the year that was absent. So yeah, it was a gift, but it was also it also kind of showcased something that I didn't have and longed for.
But what would have happened with your life, from age 12 forward if you didn't have him?
I mean, who knows? Yeah, no idea.
And I just ask that because, I can hear the fatherly role he played and how powerful that is for boys in general. We need that. We look to our dad for like guidance. It's like, I don't know what the fuck's going on. How do I do this thing called life? How do I be a man? And I mean, I haven't really asked you about your dad, but it didn't sound like he was setting a marker for that.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I lost my dad when I was 20, in the same year I went to England. And I actually hadn't spoken to him for about a year and a half before he passed away. Things got very messy between my mum and him. And, it was very clear, I think, even whilst my mum was carrying me, that they shouldn't be together. And my mum stayed in the relationship, she said, for me. But, from a very, very young age, I knew that ultimately they didn't love each other. And there was a lot of conflict in the household. And, that weighed very heavily on me. It created quite a somewhat dangerous dynamic for me growing up, just in terms of the level of conflict that existed between the two of them. And my dad didn't really know how to cope in those environments. So it was a very matriarchal house. But my mum had a real temper, and so but my dad didn't actually have the tools. He wasn't really equipped to be able to respond meaningfully in those situations. So I never actually had any healthy modeling of the process of conflict and repair. And so actually in my older life, exploring my relationship to conflict has actually been one of the most important parts of my own personal evolution, because my experience of it growing up, it was everything that it shouldn't be. It was really like quite violent at times, and very explosive, and with no meaningful process of repair afterwards. With my mum just shouting at my dad and my dad just being effectively mute, it really it created this very, very strange dynamic in the house. And I wasn't really seeing my dad playing like a leading role within that dynamic or that relationship or the household. And anyway, their relationship was very clear from a young age that they ultimately shouldn't be together, but they were staying together for me, or so they said. And that created a very tricky environment. And it really informed a lot of, my understanding of relationships and my understanding of love and things like that, and not in the healthiest way. So I've had to, in the later part of my life, really form my own deeper and new understanding of some really core fundamentals in terms of how we relate to each other and things like that.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thanks for sharing that dynamic, because I think it's not talked about enough. I really believe that. What age were you at when you're like, hey, wait a minute, what I got shown at home is like holding me back from having the connections I want as an adult?
I mean, honestly, probably 35.
Yeah.
Yeah, realistically, it was only when I kind of began a deeper process of self-inquiry that I could really start to see what impact that had on me, and start to understand how that shaped my, core beliefs of myself or my environment, or, or how conflict should be resolved between people, or what have you. And so, yeah, it came quite late for me, actually.
What was the catalyst that made you go, whoa, I gotta figure this out?
Two things: a divorce in 2018, and around the same time, I this project became such a part of my story and my identity that in 99% of people's phones in the world, I was just Nick at RA. And I kind of knew that, but at one point I realized that I was actually that to myself. And I asked myself the question, who am I without this project? Well, I didn't even call it a project at the time. That's just been an aspect of separation that I think is healthy. I was literally like, who am I without this thing? And I realized I couldn't answer that question because I'd become so enmeshed with it. And at that moment, I knew that I would need to step away from running it on a day-to-day basis to be able to actually answer that question. And yeah, that was one of the most profound moments of change in my life, actually, realizing that I'd become enmeshed with this project that was actually giving me so much. Like there was so much, validation because it's successful and it's, in the eyes of many people, it's a cool thing. And it's like, it's in the culture that I'm excited to be a part of and I'm passionate about, and it's growing and it's independent and it's sustainable economically. And all of these things that I would externally receive validation for how great it was and how great it is. And I was then absorbing that as how great I am and how good I'm doing. And what I didn't realize at the time was I was essentially outsourcing my validation externally, and it was very successful because the project was successful. And I didn't realize the unseen cost of that until I got to a point where I realized, well, hang on a minute, who am I without this thing? And then not knowing the answer to that question was an intriguing and scary moment. And so at that point, I set about finding out.
That is profound. Your experience of kind of realizing that what you did and your life mission was external validation for who you actually are. How do you feel about in the coaching space? There's a lot of emphasis put on men. It's like, find your mission and like your life will be better. So I'm really curious from your viewpoint and what you've experienced where you had that. It's like, hey, my like life mission is like going really fucking well. And then realizing, holy shit, that's not actually me. I'd be curious what you see, what your viewpoint is on the messaging to men around that.
I think it's a great question, and one I'm still pondering myself. I think we can have a different purpose for a different time. So I don't necessarily know if there's, one purpose that, that's our purpose for life, and the goal is to find that and do nothing else. And so I think this project was my purpose for a long time, until it wasn't. And, I maybe didn't have the ability to see when that shift actually took place. And I look back on it in reflection, and now I can kind of spot some of those moments when perhaps it did change, but I couldn't see it as clearly as I can now in the rearview mirror. I guess one of the most profound things that I've noticed in working as a coach for a number of years now is this consistent theme that runs through everyone I work with that is kind of anchored in this idea of trying to find purpose, is the fact that the thing that we seek is not actually the thing that we truly want. And so quite often I think someone will come to me and they'll say, okay, hey, I want to be here in 6 months' time. And I'll say, okay, that's interesting, but do you mind if we start with who you are today? And let's investigate that. Because quite often the thing that we're seeking is informed by our previous conditioning. And that definition of success has actually come from external sources, be it culture, be it society, be it parents, school, what have you. And so quite often we can strive for a goal that isn't actually ours. And I think that creates this real sense of kind of middle-aged emptiness. Like I work with a lot of men and women who are actually hyper successful in their field. And the thing that they determined was the definition of success, or the constellation of things that they thought represented success, they've actually achieved those things and more often. But there's this emptiness inside them that is actually why they're starting to ask themselves the questions that I might be able to support them with. And actually, that process of actually helping them figure out who they are in the moment, the process that I went through myself, is actually, for me, it's actually the most important place to start a coaching partnership and relationship. So I would say a simple arc in terms of what I would work on with someone over 6 months would be, who am I? What do I want? And how will I get there? And that's kind of the trajectory of the partnership. But I think it's, in my experience, it's absolutely critical to do that first phase to actually ensure that when we get to that question of what do I want, it's actually informed by the person rather than the conditioning that they may have needed to live by to get to this point. And so, and in my experience, those two things are never the same thing. So when someone comes in and says, I want to be here in 6 months, and then we go through a 1 or 2 month process of helping them figure out who they are in the moment, what integrity looks like for them, what are their values, what actually brings them joy, what do they actually want, what relationships nourish them, which don't, and essentially give them, like I often say, the work that I do is effectively helping people give themselves permission to live the life that they truly want. And so actually that question of purpose, I think we can strive to find our purpose or our project that gives us a sense of purpose, because it may be multiple projects over a lifetime. I think that's a noble pursuit, and I think that's a worthy pursuit. But the important thing is actually ensuring that that project or that desired contribution to the world or the impact that we seek to have is actually coming from our true nature rather than perhaps somebody else's measure of success.
So what would you say? Well, I'm just going to ask you. I'm not going to frame it the way I started to. Strip away your company completely. Who is Nick?
I think that answering that question is a life's work. Ultimately, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. That is my core belief. And that perspective shapes a lot of how I relate to myself and how I relate to other people and how I relate to the world. So that's at a kind of a core fundamental level. I consider myself as a spiritual being. And the project that I'm doing is literally that, just a project. I mean, one day, like it sounds like maybe a mad thing to say, but even it took me a long time to even just consider it as a project, right? Because I was so enmeshed with it. And actually, like, its success or failure doesn't define my worthiness. And actually, and no relationship to one person defines my worthiness ultimately. And so I think that's at a core level, it's a spiritual being having a human experience of learning and discovery.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I understand your languaging, and I'm like, I know people listening will be like, you two are fucking fruitcakes. Like, that makes no sense. So I want to share something from my life that like got me to that point. And then I'd love to just have a discussion on it. Like, most people know, well, not most people, but a lot of people know I had a heart attack, and it's almost 8 years ago to the day. Pretty damn close. I'm looking at the calendar. And what that taught me is anything you think you have can be taken away in the blink of an eye. So what really are we? What really do we have? What really is anything that's external actually mean? And the answer I came to was it actually means nothing. But we're at this odd place in human history where basically our existence is based on, what you do, what you have. And it's eroding our humanness, in my opinion. And the gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger to like, who's Brandon and what does Brandon do, or who's Nick and what does Nick do? So for me, purpose, I've changed the languaging because it makes more sense to me. My purpose is to connect with my spiritual, my being, with myself as deeply as I can. because when I do that, I don't need anything external. And then a project is that thing, that external thing, or the mission in my life is that external thing. And that for me has brought this sense of, oh shit, I think I just figured out what being human means. And it sounds like you've come to a very similar space where you're like, oh, yes, my company does fantastic, but wait a minute, there's more to this human thing than that.
Yeah, and it's also helped me reframe and reshape the relationships in my life. As that my love relationship that I have with a beautiful woman, I see as a spiritual contract that allows me to see and learn more about myself than I could just on my own.
Yeah.
Like everything in the world is relational, and obviously, like we have our conflicts and so on, of course, as any relationship does. But that lens of effectively that this is a choice, and this person is here to help me learn more about myself. That is the most powerful tool to be able to understand how we're showing up in a relationship, or how we're actually often responsible for contributing to the conflict that I have a tendency to jump straight to a place of victimhood, right? Which is never helpful. And actually the thing that I use to kind of pull me away from that is actually like, no, this is a spiritual contract, this relationship. Like this person is in my life to help me learn more about myself. And that reframe allows me to then very quickly access like, okay, what am I contributing to this situation? What responsibility do I need to own? And ultimately, what can I learn?
Yeah.
And then it's not about blaming myself or blaming the other person, but it's applying this kind of lens of learning that I find can be incredibly fertile ground for self-discovery. Like I learn more in relationship to my partner than I do, sat on the cushion,
Yes.
meditating on a daily basis. It's those relational moments that can sometimes be immensely challenging, that rarely in the moment, but in the days afterwards on reflection, are profound in terms of helping me discover more things about myself. Often the things that are unresolved within myself,
Yeah.
that I wish to focus on, move through, and hopefully grow as a man.
I'm chuckling because I had an interaction 2 days ago, and upon reflection, like 24 hours later, I'm like, God damn it. I was afraid. I was scared. That was a reaction, not a response to a situation. I'm like, fuck, are you kidding me? Like all the work I've done, and it's still, the relationship is the mirror. It's just
Yeah.
mirroring back all my internal stuff, which is exactly what you said. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. And that reframe will change a person's life. It doesn't matter if it's your parents or coworkers or kids. Kids, like as a father, holy shit. I'm telling you, man, like that, realizing that they're little mirrors. And if I'm feeling irritated, that's about me. That's nothing to do with them.
Mm.
Like that would change the world if parents could wrap their head around any irritation you think you have with your kids is actually about you. Like it would change the world in a generation, because it'd be like, oh, that's just bubbling up something within me.
Yeah.
And we've all been kids, and we've all been treated poorly by our parents, not intentionally, but we can feel the impact that had on us. What if we could stop that loop? Or at least be aware that that's a loop. Like that
And
blows my mind, that whole idea. It blows my mind.
and I actually think, there's a saying which is, it's never too late to have a happy childhood.
Mm.
And it's kind of, anchored in this idea of the fact that we can reparent ourselves. And I actually think, in my own experience, like I discovered a core belief recently that showed me that for a long time growing up, because there was a lot of conflict and agitation in my household, and a child doesn't believe that it's anyone's fault other than their own, because they believe their parents are gods, they can do no wrong. And actually, this being able to view it now through the lens of an understanding that, like, actually I didn't deserve it, and it wasn't about me. It was actually about, my mum or my dad, who had their own unresolved things that they were projecting onto me. That's actually helped me forgive them for some of their choices and some of their reactions rather than responses. Because once I've learned that about myself and view my own life that way, how can I not then apply that to my own reflections of my childhood experience?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's imperative, and if we just look at it the lens through men, there is such a stigma of getting help or of, mental health. And I recently saw a post on how did he word it? Something about there was the heavy responsibility men feel. And I didn't read it, but what landed for me is like, yeah, we as men feel like we got to have things figured out for the people in our life, yet we were never given any tools on what that looks like. And I think the one you're talking about, the reparenting, there's many different aspects to that, but that is such a key piece, foundational piece of the puzzle to be able to fulfill your responsibility. Men have to look at it. Like, you have to look at it. And anybody listening, if you're not going down that path with your therapist or your counselor or whoever it is, find somebody that understands how important that is, because you won't get anywhere without looking at that. I guarantee you might get some short-term results that feel good, but that core thing is always going to be there, always going to be there. And I speak from experience. I tried all these different modalities. I'm like, oh, this should work. Everybody says this should work. Doesn't mean shit until you look back and learn how to reparent yourself. And then, okay, now all these other things I did work.
I think that's profound and absolutely spot on. If we think about I mentioned core belief, like a core belief that I just discovered the other day. But we think about the importance of core beliefs that are effectively the lens through which we view the world, because they inform what we truly believe about ourselves and our environment and the people around us. Many of the core beliefs that shape our entire adult life are formed between 0 and 2. They're pre-verbal.
Yeah.
And then, you've got a bunch between 2 and 7 that, go a long way to actually shaping how we think about ourselves and the world around us. And those things are so foundational to how we see ourselves, and then as a result, the life that we live, that it's almost fruitless to be able to try and make changes on a surface level rather than really exploring what those beliefs are and understanding how they impact us in terms of, what we think we're capable of, or how we might relate to someone else, or, any number of things. And that can only really be changed by looking inside ourselves and actually looking back. And I even say that as a coach rather than a therapist. Like, I'm not, I'm the majority of work I do isn't actually spent looking back down the path. But it's definitely part of the process, because I think it's absolutely essential to helping us understand who we are today, to then be able to decide what it is that we truly want and understand all of the different ways that we get in our own way to helping us actually create that life.
Yeah. And even the simple question is like, do I want to believe what I believe? If you haven't examined what you believe, you're not doing yourself any good, because like you said, a lot of these things come from age 0 to 7. What you believe, you were just handed your belief system.
Exactly.
So you're not you but here's the thing, you can choose different. What would you say to people that make the argument, well, that's just the way I am, be it behavior, be it how they are in relationship?
That's a belief. And I'd start there. I would question that fundamental belief. Because this idea that we're fixed, we can't change, I am who I am, that is just a belief, like any of the others.
I'm just thinking of someone that I proposed I questioned their beliefs, and holy shit, the squirming that happened, because they well, nobody's ever questioned that just the way I am. We're just all, because their belief system was, well, that's just the way we are. Like, no, it's not. Yes, I understand you might get to age 40 and you've lived your life a certain way. You can still choose to change your beliefs. It's wild, but it's 100% doable.
And beautiful. Because it gives us an opportunity to, in some ways, live a different life.
Yeah.
If you have a belief that, for example, I'm not worthy of love, and then you manage to identify that belief, and then you manage to clear that belief and actually get to a point where you do believe that you're worthy of love, there will be a before life of that moment and an afterlife. And they will be fundamentally different, because how you relate to yourself and everyone else in the world will change. And the enormity of your lived experience, if you just shift that belief from one side to the other, is extraordinary. So imagine you do that on your 50 most fundamental beliefs. Like, you can live a different life.
Yeah. That's going to be a highlight clip. Well said, man. Yeah, I've lived that. Like, that unworthiness of love thing, that's pretty common. That's a pretty common one, right? And it shapes how we show up in relationship, to our detriment and our partner's detriment, really. It's one that's definitely, everybody needs to look at that one, I believe.
I have lived with that belief up until my current relationship.
Yeah. You said one thing that you discovered, your beliefs were a certain way at age 35, and that was kind of late. But I am starting to think, the more I live life and the more I experience and observe other people, this is the process. Like, we have to go through these things in order to have that aha moment. It's not too late. It's exactly when it's supposed to happen. Because if you don't have the contrast of where you were and what you really want to be, how do you know what you really want to be? I think it has to happen. As much as it kind of sucks, and I watch my, young adult children start to go through this process, it's painful to watch, but I'm like, I can't save you. You have to go through this. This seems to be part of the human experience.
I completely agree. And it's one of those ones that, it's obviously easier to look back on and actually be thankful for those moments of darkness. In 2018, I was, that year was incredibly difficult for me. I was living life a certain way. I was in a relationship that I thought everything was fine. And I thought the relationship I had with myself was fine ultimately. And then that rug got pulled out from underneath me of my own doing. And everything that I thought I knew about the world, I started to question. And I remember just nights and nights and nights just wandering the streets of London somewhat aimlessly, where everything that I thought I knew about the world felt upside down. and I felt so disorientated. In like, it's difficult for me to even like reimagine how disorientated I felt at that moment. But it really felt like everything that I thought was true was no longer true. And that was such a, a head spin, to think stupidly that I had life figured out. I knew what I was doing. I was on my trajectory, like everything was good. And then all of a sudden it wasn't. And it wasn't a gradual process for me. And I think it needed to not be, because I was taken to such a dark place and such a lost place that I didn't really have any other choice but to kind of fumble around in the dark and find the ladder to pull myself out. And I remember my first ever therapy session, and I was talking to my therapist, and he just said this line to me that ultimately changed my life. He said, "Yeah, that's all fine. That's all good. But what about your relationship to yourself?" And it took me 3 weeks of asking myself that question again and again and again to even understand what the question meant. Which is kind of ironic now because I'd like devote my life to helping people answer that question. But here I was, 35, and I had never even considered that question because I was validating my sense of self entirely externally. I was, central to a big group of friends. I had loads of friends. I was like showing up in the world in a certain way. I had a project that was going well. I was having loads of fun, like all of these things. But the unseen cost of that was not knowing myself. And so actually when someone said, "Yeah, but what about your relationship to yourself?" Like it honestly took me 3 weeks of thinking about that question to even understand what that question meant. And then, I that's also why I'm so passionate about coaching, because I've seen the impact that the right question at the right time can have on someone's life. And that question in that moment fundamentally changed my life, because I eventually figured out, oh yeah, you can have a relationship with yourself. And then that kind of got the ball rolling. And then that's been my, or at least one of my primary focuses for many, many years now.
Yeah, it's so fundamental, and it's something we're not taught. That question. And it's without that question, not a lot of what you do in life makes sense, because it's all for something outside versus the inside. I knew this was going to happen. I'm watching the clock, and I'm okay with the fact that it feels like there's a lot unsaid and more we could talk about. I got 2 questions for you to close this out. First one is, what message do you have for 12-year-old Nick?
You're worthy of love just as you are.
What message do you have for men listening?
It's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to share or to experience and to share your feelings. The first question I ask myself or anyone else when they're stuck is, what am I unwilling to fully feel? The speed with which that takes me to the energetic blockage is remarkable. And then I have a choice. Do I want to fully feel this feeling or not? But it helps me identify where I'm stuck with almost immediacy. And usually it's sadness or anger. And I didn't know that it was okay to feel those things or learn how to feel those things. And so I would say that to men, that it's not only is it okay to feel, it's essential to feel, to live a life of authenticity and vitality. And in my work facilitating men's groups, these are spaces of non-response. They're just spaces for listening. Because what I've seen as one of the most powerful tools to challenge the patriarchal conditioning that so many of us grew up within is this idea of being in spaces with men and sharing our feelings and being received with love from other men in those environments can have the most extraordinary impact on our lives, because it rewires those core beliefs that it's weak to do this, it's not okay, I need to have my shit together. And so I facilitate men's groups in 4-week chapters. So we go on these small journeys together as 7 or 8 men. And just by creating those environments, I've seen men come to these places and, they're slightly nervous perhaps in week 1. Week 2, they realize that it's safe to share something. They'll share something that they've been holding on for 10, 15 years sometimes. They'll be received with love when they share that, which is just the most profound thing for so many of us, especially from other men. And then they realize that it's safe to share that thing and that they're still worthy having had that experience or thinking those things or what have you. And often they'll then find the courage to take it to their partner. And I've never seen it not well received by the partner, for that man showing up authentically and sharing with vulnerability what's truly alive in them. And then you speak 3-4 months later, and it was that moment that totally changed the nature of their relationship. And it just dropped it down to a whole nother level of depth and intimacy and trust and vulnerability. And all that we really did was just create a space where men could share what they were feeling in a safe way. And so I would say to men, it's okay to ask for help. It's actually essential. And it's essential to feel. And it's okay to feel.
It's like trying to explain sight to a blind man is the best way I've heard it explained. And you just have to experience it. You have to experience it. So for men listening, take heed of what Nick just said. It's very, very powerful. Nick, thanks so much for this, man. So powerful. Where can people get a hold of you if they'd like to have a chat with you or work with you?
Sure. It's just nicksabine.coach on Instagram, or that's also the URL.
Awesome. And I'll put that link in the show notes as well. Thanks for being here, man. Profound chat. It's going to be very helpful for men listening.
It was deeply enjoyable. Thanks, Brandon.
Thanks for taking the time to be here today. I honestly hope you found something you can use in your life. And I hope you found some relief in knowing that you're not the only one with challenges. We can be very isolated as men. If you don't have support in your life, please reach out to someone. It's okay to need help. It doesn't mean that you're less of a man. In fact, it takes a courageous man to know when it's time to ask for guidance. Until next time, brother.